Hi, I'm Dr. Joe Baxter Webb. Welcome back to the Indie Game Clinic, the channel where I take an indie game that is currently being developed and cut it open with the scalpel, look inside of it, root around, maybe find out what's wrong with it, suggest some ways that the developer can make a better game than they're currently making. Today I'm going to be looking at a Pokemon style game from a web developer from Canada called Mike Mora. Hello Mike. I'm really looking forward to having a play of this and discussing it and seeing what we can learn from it. And it's got a nice mix of this sort of N64 late 90s lo-fi aesthetic with these more modern bloom effects, which I think is really nice. It creates a sense of wonder and it's got a good balance of the environment feeling sort of adventurous and wondrous while also being a little bit threatening without being too scary. So it's Pokemon, but it's also got hints of Zelda and stuff like that. So I think this is a good start. In terms of the gameplay, my first experience of it was dying a bunch of times. I was thrown into the game with a monster that couldn't beat any of the monsters that I encountered. And I understand when we're working on the early stages of a project, you're not thinking about onboarding and tutorialization and stuff like that. But if you want people to play this demo and have a nice experience and want to continue playing it, you have to give them an experience of winning at the beginning. In the combat that I did experience, I was trying to play the game as if I didn't know anything about Pokemon, because your game still needs to be self-explanatory, even for someone who has played Pokemon, because they might not have played it in years. It needs to be obvious how it works. When I was playing the combat, I couldn't really tell the difference between my moves. They said they had different power levels, but that was it. I couldn't tell if they expended any sort of resource, so there was no reason to choose the move with the lower power level, and that led to me feeling confused about what the difference was, and also just feeling like I wasn't making any sort of meaningful decisions during that combat, because it was just, I've got a light type, they've got a dark type, use the light move, use the highest power one, just press the same button over and over again. So even if we resolved the difficulty issue and made some of these first fights easier so I could win them, I still wasn't really in a position where I felt like I was making any meaningful choices during the combat. The starting area was quite well set up with an introductory quest where I needed to get a certain amount of money to get a torch. The monsters all had pretty cute names that used the same sort of naming convention as Pokemon, where they were portmanteau names using two different words. Some of these made me chuckle, I enjoyed them. The visual aesthetic is pretty strong, although sometimes it's a bit too easy for the character to get lost on some of the darker backgrounds, like you see here. The other thing is that this particular lo-fi font isn't very good at large sizes, particularly when it's fast-moving text like these damage numbers. Usually making text larger makes it more legible, but when you're using a very, very low pixel count pixel font like this, it doesn't help. So that's something to bear in mind in the future. Some of these animated visual effects in the town are really pretty, but they also feel like they're dominating a little bit. All of these kind of fires in town look more important than they should do. They're really just light sources, but they look like they're quest markers or something because they're really screaming, "Look at me," the entire time. And this open fire, or whatever it is, outside the town, it initially looked like it was going to be some sort of Fortnite jump pad, so I tried to jump on it and see if it would bounce me, but it didn't do anything because it wasn't one of those, it was something else. It does help that these flames look a little bit like arrows. Broadly speaking, one of the things the game is missing at the moment is a sense of why my character is a monster trainer or has control over monsters. The Pokemon games have a world where there are entire industries built around catching and training Pokemon, and the fiction of that world gives you a very clear sense of why you want to catch them all. Here I'm just sort of hobo Link, and I'm running around, and I don't really understand why I'm catching and battling monsters, and then there's this wizard in town who's scared to go outside. What makes me special? I'm not necessarily advocating for pages and pages of lore dump to help explain that, because I don't think it will add much, but having some initial sense of what my character's job or role or chosen one status is in the world would help me understand the stakes of this world and why my player character is able to do these things that the villagers can't. So far we've just been looking at the game on its own terms. It's a 3D homage to older Pokemon games. It has quite a unique aesthetic that some people will find very appealing. On the whole, I think this project is quite promising. The developer knows what they're doing from a technical point of view. A lot of these basic mechanics that make this genre work are in place. But this is a good time to talk about a larger issue that this game represents or is an example of, and which might also be a problem that other indie developers are struggling with and can learn from, and that is the curse of the homage. Is it homage or homage? 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 Homage, the proper way to say it. Making a game which is such a clear love letter to an existing game has its pros and its cons. And the cons can be such big ones that you really have to work super hard to overcome them. You get a really strong, proven idea to base your game on, something that you know you like and that other people like, and presumably you get the fandom of that game or that genre to design your game around. So in this case, you can imagine an audience. That audience is like a combination of people who like the Pokemon games and, you know, people who enjoy this visual style. The problem with trying to appeal to Pokemon fans is they've already got Pokemon, right? And your game becomes the "we've got McDonald's at home" meme, but for Pokemon. The audience is always going to compare what you're making to the source material. So you then have to work really hard to live up to that source material by having 150 monsters with enough cosmetic and mechanical variation, or you have to differentiate your game in some other way. But don't worry, we're going to work out how we can do that. I can see some potential issues that are going to hold this game back. By the end of this video, I can at least set Mike up with some design questions to go away and ask himself so that he can complete this process of differentiating his game from the source material and making it into a compelling design in its own right. The next phrase I'm going to use might be one that you've heard way too many times, or it might be one that you haven't heard before, and it might be a phrase that makes you vomit because you're an artistic tinkerer and you hate any kind of business language. And that phrase is unique selling point, or USP.
What are you selling?
A unique selling point is a thing which makes a product stand out in the market. It's what differentiates it from similar things. To give an example from Hollywood, the famous elevator pitch for the Alien movie was "It's Jaws, but in space." And there are loads of examples of games which are basically this format, but with Pokemon. For example, Power World is Pokemon with guns. Shin Megami Tensei is emo Pokemon with mythical creatures from real-world folklore. That one's a little bit of a mouthful. It might not work as an elevator pitch unless you're in a really long elevator ride. How about Darkest Dungeon is Pokemon, but with Dungeons and Dragons characters who are mentally ill?
To catch them is my real test. To train them is my cause.
Anyway, this format, this "it's X but Y" format, can be a really easy way to explain how your game idea is sort of like something else but with a twist. Right? Here's the familiar thing, and here's what makes it different. The second part should make people go, huh? A little bit.
Huh?
It shouldn't explain the whole idea. When someone says, "It's Jaws in space," there's part of you that goes, "Oh yeah, that works," right? And there's part of you that goes, "Huh, how does that work?" This familiar thing and this thing that makes it unusual, and put them together. If you can create that sense of like, "Oh, I'm interested to see what that's like," you've succeeded, your elevator pitch has worked, and your premise, your unique selling point is appealing to people. But the important thing to understand about trying to develop a compelling unique selling point is that just because an idea is unique doesn't mean it's good. Oh, it's Pokemon, but the monsters don't want to fight, and every time you get them to fight, they cry, and they write in their diary about it. Maybe some people might want to play that, but it's a small audience. Your elevator pitch that explains your unique selling point should help you to define your player base with more clarity, and the unique selling point has to clearly add value to the player. Now, the developer of this game, Mike, is just one person. I'm pretty sure that he doesn't have the time to make a game with the scope of Pokemon. 150 of these monsters with enough mechanical variety to rival a mainline Pokemon game. Even just playing this demo, I couldn't really see enough difference between the individual moves of one monster. So that raises questions for me about how are you going to make even more of these monsters, because that's part of what makes Pokemon work, is that there are just so many monsters and then the individual monsters have so many different sets of moves. Another general point about indie development that is probably going to come up time and time again on this channel is, yeah, we all know it's hard, sympathize with how hard making a game is, but the audience do not care about that, right? The audience don't care that you're just one person. They just judge the game based on what it is or isn't to them. I know that we get inundated with stories of how amazing it is that this game or that game was made by just one person, but those are only the games that live up to those expectations in the first place. We're only interested in the idea of the solo developer wunderkind when they produce the type of game we'd associate with a larger team. If you have any sense that the audience is going to be okay with, oh, it's Pokemon with 10% of the stuff because they know it was only one person working on it, they're not going to care about that. They really won't have any sympathy for the fact that you're a solo developer. People only care that you're a solo developer with limited resources after you make something which is impressive in terms of its scope and its ambitions. So that leaves you with two options, and by you I mean the developer Mike, but I also mean you generally in the audience if you're making a similar project and any of this is relevant to you. You can either work yourself to death making a game which has as much content as that commercially produced game you're basing your game on, or you can pivot to something which is similar to that game but has an interesting twist, and try and make it so that that twist is enough to mean that you now don't have to make 150 monsters. Ideally, that twist needs to be something which opens the game up to a different audience, not just people who like Pokemon, and which makes use of the fact that you only have limited resources. It's something that is more forgiving of the fact that you're a solo developer or a small team. If we want to see Terra Dentium stand on its own as a unique game that has its own appeal outside of just being a Pokemon clone, maybe we can do that in a way that gives it some sort of unique mechanics and also a unique theme. If we're smart about it, we can solve that earlier issue I identified about not knowing what my character's role is, who I am and what I'm doing in this world, in a way which also gets rid of the need to make a million different monsters. Earlier in the video, I jokingly described Darkest Dungeon as Pokemon with mentally ill Dungeons & Dragons characters. It was a silly comparison, but it's not totally untrue. And maybe it's an example we can delve into a little bit more here to see what we can learn. Darkest Dungeon is a bit like Pokemon in some ways, but it only has 16 unit types. Each of those units has a set of moves, and if you collect 2 of the same type, they might have different move sets, just like Pokemon in the mainline Pokemon games or in Pokemon Go. There's also the issue of maintenance, spending resources to level them up, treating them for those long-term conditions that I just mentioned, and giving them trinkets to use. And the difference between Pokemon and Darkest Dungeon, okay, there are quite a few differences, but at an abstract design level, it's a difference of breadth versus depth. 150 monsters which aren't that different to each other versus 16 different character types which are a lot more different from each other and which develop differently over time. Let's just say we're going entirely back to the drawing board with Terra Dentium with the theme. So I'm not even going to say monsters, I'm going to call them units now. We have more distinction between the units and make each unit feel more different from its counterparts and maybe give the player more agency over the long-term development of those units. Those are all good ways to add depth and make up for the lack of different units overall. Come at it from that angle of mechanics first, game design first, changing breadth into depth. But what if we come at it from the point of view of theme first? What if we thematically reframe the entire game so that the world and setting make more sense, feel more unique and more distinct from Pokemon, and also help to make sense of any mechanical differences we want to introduce? So let's imagine a version of this style of game where there are relatively few types of units. There's just 8 monsters or less, but you upgrade them using cybernetics, and you can massively change what powers they have by doing that. Now the player character becomes some sort of crazy inventor type, and it's very clear why they can do that and why the people in the village can't do that. Or what if you stick to an even smaller set of starting monsters, but theme them in such a way that justifies them being less varied? So, what if they're robots, or what if they're undead? There's a reason why there would be less variety in a set of undead than there is in Pokemon. And people will be more forgiving of it because you're basing it on their expectation of the trope of robots or the trope of the undead, rather than the entire massive IP that is Pokemon, that is all built around this breadth of variety of monster designs. What if you made it dinosaurs? Because you only really need to cover 5 or 6 dinosaurs to have most people's favorite dinosaur. If you make it about robots, then it's going to attract people who are thematically interested in robots. If you make it about necromancers and the undead, it's going to have a similar thing with a different audience. There are ways of reframing the game to a different theme that helps to justify why you have less monsters in the first place. And that's going to make people a bit more forgiving of this, because instead of seeing it as, oh, it's Pokemon and the only unique thing about it is that it's not as good as Pokemon because it doesn't have as much stuff, it starts to have something unique about it, something that has a different appeal. We've talked about how theme can help you tackle the issue of breadth, of having less different units. But what about depth?
Wow, you're You're so deep.
So in the Darkest Dungeon example, the depth comes from afflictions that the characters can get and the different ways you treat those and the way that you upgrade your town so that you can treat those things more efficiently. So there is a lot of depth that comes out of that kind of long-term maintenance of the characters. When we think about depth in any sort of monster training, unit collection game, concepts like caretaking, upgrading, like the example I gave before about cybernetic upgrades. What if your world is full of mechanical monsters like Horizon Zero Dawn and the player character is some sort of chosen one because they're the only one with the know-how to be able to put a rocket launcher on a dinosaur? I don't know. These might not all be the best ideas, but hopefully they illustrate the type of thinking you need to do to get out of the trap of the Homage game. I think I said it right that time. You don't have the resources in terms of asset creation to go for the breadth of content that makes Pokemon work. You're going to benefit in other ways if you don't try and do that, if you exchange breadth for depth. In order to do that, it's probably best to go back to the basic question of who is the player character in the world fiction, how and why do they collect these units, whatever they are, why do they battle them, and why is it that there's villagers who can't do this, right? What makes the player character special in this world? There's another issue with making a game as an homage to another game, especially when it comes to retro games that are quite old, and that is becoming a slave to outdated mechanics that the rest of the world has moved on from. Let's think about that for a minute, because this might be another place where you can come up with something innovative. Turn-based tactical games are one of my favourite genres, but in order for them to work, they really need to answer one core question. What decisions am I making on a turn? If my attacks have different levels of effectiveness, different resource costs, and maybe even different levels of risk and reward, then I have some decisions to make. Some of these games are going to put more of an emphasis on the long-term strategy of what do I do outside of combat in terms of equipping my characters or whatever. Less emphasis on what I do inside combat. But currently, the combat as it is in this game, I don't feel like I'm making any decisions. I think even if you get more of the features in that are in Pokemon, like these attacks being different from each other, you're still going to suffer a little bit from that problem. Here's the blasphemous thing I want to say here. Start from the assumption that Pokemon is bad and has things wrong with it. If you imagine your audience as someone who likes the combat gameplay in Pokemon, then you're back to square one again with this problem of, well, why don't they just play Pokemon? And the people who don't like the combat in Pokemon don't like it for a reason, and that reason is that it's not very good. In jRPGs like the old Final Fantasy games and most games that are made with RPG Maker engines, each turn of combat can be pretty similar, and I'm really just deciding whether to use a resource expensive skill, spend an item, or use one of the free actions like attacking or guarding. The variety of characters and equipment mean that the metagame, the upgrading and choosing how to equip the heroes, becomes just as important as what I'm doing in combat sessions. And then the combat sessions become this kind of resource management game of how quickly do I spend my mana, or how much health do I let the enemy take off me before I use a potion, and all of that kind of stuff. Now, Pokemon is 1 versus 1. It's a dueler, which means the turn-by-turn decisions are generally a bit less rich than a game where you have 4 characters fighting against 4 characters. However, Pokemon does have this mechanic of tagging monsters in and out, which I wasn't able to see in Terra Dentium because I couldn't get to a point where I had more than one monster. That mechanic, that tagging in and out, does create a sort of push-your-luck, anti-upping element similar to playing poker or blackjack, which in itself is quite interesting and exciting. The game then becomes one of judging the situation to know how late you can leave it before swapping your monsters. If Terra Dentium continues on its current design trajectory, then it will need to include that element. Maybe it already does have that element, but I couldn't play it because I only had one monster and kept getting killed before I could get a second monster. However, even with the monster swapping of a complete Pokemon game or the multiple party members of a jRPG, those turn-based combat systems can still feel quite outdated, and that's probably why Final Fantasy don't do them anymore. The reason I say this is that on most turns in these games there is a clear good choice, and I suspect that many people who haven't played Pokemon since they were a kid and have fond memories of playing it actually enjoyed it more because of the monsters themselves, or the exploration and the collection and all of those metagame elements. They played it sort of in spite of the combat rather than because of the combat. I think by and large people like the IP, but they wouldn't be playing a similar game with the same combat in because the combat isn't really that compelling. Even if you don't agree with me and you think that is good combat and you think it is good design to put players in a position of working out what the most efficient attack is and then just pressing the same button 5 turns in a row, I still think we can make something better if we look at how some more modern indie games have responded to some of those same design problems that turn-based combat games often have. Namely, this issue of every turn being bereft of any real decision making because you're either outgunned and you're going to lose, or you have an ability which is always the obvious choice that you should just do. So in Slay the Spire, you're controlling a single character, like in Pokemon, but the deck builder element means that the choices you have access to change each turn, resulting in opportunities for the game to deliver both epic fails and legendary combos if the player is smart and looks out for them and builds their deck for them in the metagame. Darkest Dungeon isn't a deck builder, it has set abilities your party member can take each turn, very similar to Pokemon, but the party formation is important in this game. Characters have abilities which only work if they're at the front or at the back, and some abilities will manipulate the positions of allies and enemies and move everyone around on the battlefield. And Roguebook combines elements of both of these games. It re-implements Slay the Spire's card-based turn choices and Darkest Dungeon's emphasis on formation and relative character positions. These games simply have a more interesting set of decisions for players to make on each round of combat. They don't turn it into a fully grid-based simulation Warhammer type thing. Combat is still reasonably abstract, but they give us examples of ways to make turn-based combat more interesting. I'm not saying Terra Dentium should be a deck builder or have a spatial element to its combat. My point is really just the turn-based combat in old jRPG games has problems with not really requiring that much turn-to-turn tactical thinking. And here are some newer games offering examples of how designers have approached that problem. Now, I think if you put nostalgia aside, the original Pokemon games were made for children. That's why they emphasize a lot of luck and a large degree of grinding. They're meant to reward engagement and frequent play rather than super high level tactical thinking. So if you're making a game and marketing it on Steam to adults who may have played Pokemon at some point in the past but don't play it anymore, even if they think they want to play Pokemon, that might not really be what they want to do anymore. A lot of people's memories of playing these games is rose-tinted because of when they played them. Have you played Snakes and Ladders as an adult? Or sorry, Chutes and Ladders if you're American. Or Tic-Tac-Toe? The first one is a game of complete chance. And the second one is a game where there are turns where there's just a clearly best move and you don't really have any option except to do the obviously good thing. Those are two examples of games which are fine when you're kids and you don't realise how they work. But as adults, we don't find Chutes and Ladders or Tic-Tac-Toe particularly compelling or engaging, because once we know what the best choice is, or once we know that the thing is mostly just driven by randomness, there's no thinking anymore. It doesn't engage us. Even if we go for that initial target audience of Pokemon fans or people who are nostalgic for Pokemon, even if you spent the next year turning Terra Dentium into a feature-complete love letter to Pokemon with 150 monsters or more, you might eventually find out that the audience don't really want what they think they want, because their memories of Pokemon come from a time when they were happy to play a bad game. Now that I've upset every Pokemon fan, let's get back to the point. Terra Dentium is going to need to do something to address the fundamental issue of what decisions am I making during combat. In the most simple version of a Pokemon clone, once I've realised that my fire type's most expensive attack can kill a grass type in 3 turns rather than 5 turns, I just know the correct thing to do in that situation. And it becomes a game of just remembering the thing I did last time and doing it. To address that, you have to find ways to make the combat have more interesting decisions in it. The ways of addressing that issue are not going to come from looking at Pokemon. They're going to come from stepping back from that source material and thinking about other games and how they've handled this issue. If you want to keep the combat relatively simple and close to Pokemon, maybe focus on the metagame, on the training, the upgrading, the equipping, making that deep enough so it feels like that's where the interesting decisions live. I think in all of these games, whether you're looking at Pokemon or early Final Fantasy or one of the more recent games I've mentioned, there's actually quite a sophisticated balance of long-term strategy of upgrading a thing and making decisions about that, and the turn-to-turn tactics within the combat. And finding a way to deliver on both of those things is going to be hard. And I think the answer is going to lie in, what is the theme here? If you theme this as a different thing, so it's less obviously like Pokemon, if you theme it as being a game about a roboticist or a necromancer, that theme is going to give birth to other ideas that might solve some of those other problems, both in terms of the tactical element of what am I doing during the combat, and the strategic element of what's happening with my units to upgrade them. The theme and who the player character is and how they fit into the setting. If you're willing and open to change that, and change what the monsters are, change what the units represent, away from being direct analogues to Pokemon, then you're going to enter into a really creative space where you can start to answer multiple design questions at once, because you've stepped away from this desire to make something that is like Pokemon. Don't try and make something that's like Pokemon. Try and make something that's better than Pokemon, or at least more interesting in some way. So to summarize, for Mike to turn Terra Dentium into a really strong game in this genre, I think he needs to answer all of the following design questions, and they fit into two categories, I think. The first one is thematic. Who is the player character? I don't care about their name. I don't really care what they look like apart from what it signals, but what is their job? What is their role within the world? How do they relate to the units, whether they're monsters or something else? And why is it that they collect them and train them and other people don't? You could make all of that stuff exactly the same as Pokemon, but I think trying to deliberately make it different from Pokemon is going to solve some of the other problems that this game currently has. The second category of questions are quite abstract game design questions. They're mechanical game design questions. And those are, where are the interesting decisions happening in this game? Should they be happening during combat? Should they be happening outside of combat? If they're happening in both places, what's the balance? Because, like I said a minute ago, all the games in this genre do a balance of these two things and do it quite well. I think if you can answer these design questions in a way that all of the answers link up and fit together, marry a new theme to some slightly different mechanics for the game, you're going to be onto a winner. If you disagree with me about Pokemon and any of my advice I've given today, please write loads of comments and have a big argument in my comments and do lots of engagement stuff. That's fine by me. That's very helpful for the channel. Whether you agreed or didn't, but you think this channel is a great idea and a helpful resource, there's also a link in the descriptions, not only of how to submit your game if you want to do that, but also a link to my Patreon. It's just going to help me to continue doing these, maybe allow me to buy a camera that isn't a potato at some point. If it ever makes big boy money, I might be able to do this full time and even review 2 games a week. Can you imagine? I'm Dr. Joe Baxter Webb. You've been watching Indie Game Clinic. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and tune in next time